You just heard Dinesh D'Souza tell us about the horrors of these political prosecutions by the Obama administration, which I asked former AG Mike Mukasey about a short while ago. Judge Mukasey, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We just heard my interview with Dinesh D'Souza about the horrors of these political prosecutions, what he believes, by the Obama administration. And his experience certainly has some implication, I think, for the Russia investigation, as we might look at this unholy alliance of the FBI Director Jim Comey and DOJ prosecutors. What do you think about, for lack of a better term, this runaway prosecution that a lot of us are concerned about?
I think that in the normal course, that sort of case would have been prosecuted with the outcome being a fine. It's not one of Preet Bharara's brighter chapters that he participated in prosecuting this in the way that he did. He's had a couple of other dings and dents, but that was, I think, a pretty substantial one.
Judge Mukasey, Adam Schiff said that the pardon of Dinesh D'Souza is basically a transparent effort by the president to signal to others that, look, if you do right by me, I'll do right by you.
It's further evidence of a corrupt intent on the president's part, further evidence that he may have violated the law by obstructing justice in the firing of Comey, but in other efforts as well. It looks a lot like a message to Michael Cohen, who may also be implicated in exceeding campaign limits with that Stormy Daniels payment. And then you have the further announcement by the president that he may pardon Martha Stewart, another TV personality who was convicted of, guess what, obstruction of justice and lying to authorities. So he's nothing if not transparent.
Oh, please. They've said the same thing every time he either issues a pardon or makes a statement, that it's a signal, it's a dog whistle, and so on and so forth. I think the prosecution of Dinesh D'Souza in the way that it was done was unjustified. I think the prosecution of Martha Stewart was dubious. And so far as Rod Blagojevich, I thought the prosecution of him was entirely justified. Now, the president simply commuted his sentence. I don't know whether he should have done that or not. He served 6 years, and that's a judgment call. He was certainly not pardoned.
Let's talk about what John Brennan has been up to. He's now a commentator on another network, and of course former top intel official, the U.S. government. But he has been on a tear on President Trump.
I think Mr. Trump has demonstrated a paranoia and insecurity, as well as a real concern about the investigation that is underway. Certainly his tweets do not seem like they're coming from a person of innocence and confidence.
My reaction is, ordinarily would be that John Brennan was director of the CIA and maybe should be told to stick to his day job. The trouble is, I think, given what we're finding out about the way he did his day job, including his participation in putting an informant into the Trump campaign, maybe we're better off with him as kind of an amateur pundit. I think that he may be projecting his own views, if I may be an amateur psychiatrist for the moment, onto the president, because he is going to have a lot to answer for, I believe, when the entire story gets told about what the CIA was doing in connection with the running of the investigation, and what it was doing with regard to what had been its informant, and his being put into the Trump campaign.
We talked a little about this on radio this morning, Judge, but you made a great point, and you asked this question, which is why you're so smart. Who paid this informant? Was he just doing this pro bono, this work for the Clinton campaign or for the U.S. government? Well, I mean, what was it? Who paid?
Understand, his history was as a CIA asset. Being put into an FBI investigation is very odd. Understand, these two agencies, number one, don't share their toys very well, and aren't supposed to. The CIA is supposed to operate in an outward-looking, foreign-directed fashion. They're not supposed to be doing anything in the United States. There's a statute that restricts that. The FBI conducts intelligence investigations in the United States. And for him to be put into essentially an FBI investigation, I kind of like to know how that happened, who coordinated it, who paid him, and how that was arranged, and when it was arranged.
Barbara McQuaid is a former U.S. attorney appointed by Barack Obama, and she said the following today.
I think today's news about Michael Cohen really shows you what he expects in an attorney general. His experience with a lawyer is someone like Michael Cohen, a pit bull, a Roy Cohn, someone who will protect him, someone who will be very aggressive in defending his interests no matter what, being loyal to President Trump as opposed to loyal to the mission. And if that is his motivation, that is a crime.
For her to comment on what President Trump's expectations are in his attorney general, when the attorney general who served in the Obama administration, Eric Holder, referred to himself as the president's wingman, strikes me as pretty rich.
Yeah, I mean, you were attorney general. I mean, talk about the relationship between a president and the attorney general. People are making this out to be such a crime that President Trump wanted an attorney general whose first instinct it was not to recuse himself. Now, the recusal issue is something, you know, we've talked about before, but that has stuck in the president's craw. Now, if I were the president, I would not be tweeting, I wish I hadn't selected Jeff Sessions. I don't know what he thinks that gets him. I don't think that's particularly wise to do. But nevertheless, that's how he feels. And he thought, well, why am I appointing you attorney general if the first thing you do is recuse yourself?
Well, the circumstances kind of caught up with Jeff Sessions and with the president. And at the time that Jeff Sessions recused himself, it may be that he technically didn't have to, because the investigation at that point was a foreign intelligence investigation, not a criminal investigation. But then, due in large measure to things that the president said and did, it became a criminal investigation. And at that point, regulations required that Jeff Sessions recuse himself. Now, for the president to suggest that somehow Jeff Sessions should have had the gift of prophecy and known that the situation would develop that way, I think is ridiculous. And for him to start claiming that he should have appointed somebody else is inane. It doesn't, as you point out, it doesn't serve his interest, particularly when he's got an AG in place in the person of Jeff Sessions, who is pursuing his agenda and very effectively bringing MS-13 cases, immigration cases, concluding a huge antitrust settlement, effectively running the Justice Department. So I think you ought to quit complaining about that.
Judge Michael Mukasey, former Attorney General of the United States, thanks so much.